Again, I want to give everyone a tremendous yasher koach on your siyum, and you should be zoche to go mechoyel al choyel, from strength to strength, to continue to grow in your learning, to finish many, many masechtas, and to always chazer the masechtas that you learned. But we're continuing with our discussion of Tanakh. Let me just mention one final observation about the writing of the Torah. I'm going to go back a little bit on this. And I hesitate to mention it, but I'll mention it because some people, both in Or Sameach and outside of Or Sameach, have asked me this question. They came across something. Obviously, in everything I've said about the description of the Torah, I've said over and over and over again that every single word of the Torah and every single letter of the Torah was dictated by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We discussed when it was written and which times, which events. We discussed that. But the bottom line of everything was every letter Hashem dictated to Moshe, with the possible exception of the last 8 verses of the Torah, which may have been written by Yoshua, but even according to that, it was dictated by God. And if you remember the Vilna Gaon says that the most Yoshua did was divided into words, but Moshe did write the unbroken sequence of letters. Now, this is the yesod of the Rambam. The Rambam says in many, many places that it is a foundation of faith that every letter of the Torah was dictated by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and anyone that says Moshe or anybody else added anything to the Torah is a heretic. This is apikorsis. This is kafira. Now, the truth of the matter is I would just stop there because as far as you need to know, that's all you need to know. However, there's always a little bit of a however, and that is there are a few Rishonim, among which are the Ibn Ezra, and even people a little later than the Ibn Ezra of Yehuda HaChassid, who actually do say that it is possible that there were things that were added to the Torah of a non-halachic nature, meaning nobody says there was any detail that was added, everything is from Hashem. But there are some opinions that say that certain narrative phrases may have been added later. And let me give you one example of what the Ibn Ezra focuses on. If you look at the end of Parshas Vayishlach, the end of Parshas Vayishlach gives a whole yichus of Esav, all of the yichus of Esav. And it goes into many, many generations. And then it says, the following are the kings of Edom is Esav, who ruled before there was a king in Israel. Meaning Esav had 8 generations of kings before we had our king. Now, here's the question. Our first king was Shaul HaMelech. So what the pasuk is saying is, I'm giving you a list of kings who ruled before we had our king. But if you go with the traditional understanding that every part of the Torah was dictated by God to Moshe, and Moshe wrote it, then how could Moshe be writing about the list of the Edomite kings who ruled before we had our king? When he's writing that, we didn't have our king yet. So the Ibn Ezra concludes, or at least, well, I shouldn't say he brings as a possibility, that these types of historical lists may have been added later. Now, now it doesn't say by whom and whatever, but I just want to point out that the Rambam absolutely rejects this, and the Rambam considers this apikorsis and kafira. I wouldn't even have brought this up, but I do bring it up because you might hear something about these mysterious Ibn Ezra. So just be aware that the Ibn Ezra does acknowledge the possibility of post-Mosaic additions to the Torah, but under no circumstances do they pertain to mitzvos or halachos or commandments. There is no one that says they were added later. All of these were given to Moshe Rabbeinu and inscribed in the Torah al pi Hashem. I didn't hear you.
The group referred to as the Masoretic.
A Masoretic, yeah. Mm-hmm.
They took many Sifrei Torah and they took what was the majority girsa, let's say,
Yeah.
and made that official as the Sefer Torah that we have now. Is that true? Is that false?
Yeah, yes. The truth of the matter is, the Gemara itself says that. The Gemara itself says that when there were multiple Sifrei Torah that had different texts, there were people who had to paskin and look at what a majority of the Sfarim said, and they were koveya that as the official text. And those people are called the Balei Masorah, the people who are in possession of the received tradition. And in scholarly language, the text that we have is called the Masoretic text, because it is based on the Balei Masorah. So the Gemara does indicate that if there are differences among Sifrei Torah, you paskin al pi rov. But again, let me just remind you, I think I had shared with you a Kabbalistic thought that even that does not mean there was a mistake in one of them, but rather these represent different tribal Sifrei Torah al pi Hashem. And then the assumption is, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's desire is that when we don't know our tribes, we should follow the majority, that is Nispashe. But it wasn't a question of one of them being wrong or the like. Remember, that was something I had mentioned to you, yeah.
Sorry, Rob, can you just maybe expound on that a little more about different tribes?
Yeah, I had mentioned the other day that here's the problem. You know, one of the arguments that people make that the Torah comes from God is the fact that even though we have had thousands and tens of thousands of Sefer Torahs over thousands of years, the discrepancies are minuscule. The discrepancies among Sifrei Torah are very tiny. You can count them on less than two hands, and therefore they are 99.99% the same. The question becomes, okay, they are 99.99% the same, but they are 0.01% different. So how do you explain differences unless you posit there were mistakes or breakdowns in transmission? So it's a difficulty. How do you account for some Sifrei Torah have a different, slightly different text? So I had mentioned to you a thought from the Kamarna Rav, who was a Hasidic Rebbe, he was a great Makobel, based on the idea that Chazal tell us on the last day of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, he wrote 13 Sifrei Torah. One was put in the Kodesh HaKodashim, and then each tribe got its own Sefer Torah. So that's in the Gemara itself. So the Rebbe wants to suggest that the Torahs that were written for each tribe were slightly different. Now, we don't even know the significance, but the little few differences reflect some spiritual meaning that is miyuchad for Reuven, Shimon, Levi. So when you have Torahs with divergent texts, he wants to say it's not that somebody made a mistake. It's not that God gave X, and if you have Y, your Torah is wrong. Rather, God gave X and Y and Z. And what survives among us are different remnants of tribal Sifrei Torah. So even if halachically we use the majority reading, that does not mean, al pi Kabbalah, that the minority Torah is a bad Torah. It just means that that was miyuchad for a tribe, and we don't know which tribe, and we also don't know the meanings. Meaning, if you have, like, one example would be the word Patsua Daka. Patsua Daka is just a halacha that somebody with crushed testicles is not allowed to marry. Okay, so the word Daka, which means crushed, in some Sifrei Torah is spelled with an aleph, and in some Sifrei Torah it's spelled with a hey. Doesn't change the meaning, but it is a different letter. So according to the Kamarna Rebbe, Hashem gave both versions. Now we don't know the whole story, but Hashem gave the aleph version to some tribes. Hashem gave the hey version to other tribes. Why? What's the significance of the aleph versus the hey? We don't even know. But apparently on a mystical level, these are differences that are appropriate to the shirish, the roots of the neshama of every tribe. So this is at least Kabbalistically, this is a beautiful way to reconcile the unity and divinity of the Torah with divergent readings. Because if you posit that God gave the Torah in only one particular way, then by definition, you're acknowledging the possibility of mistakes creeping into the system. And that's a very dangerous, risky idea because that could undermine the whole notion of Masorah. It's like the old telephone game, right? You know the telephone game. I whisper something to you and it goes down the line. By the time the 10th guy gives you the message, it's totally different. But the way the Kamarna Rebbe explains it, there were no mistakes in transmission. These are literally tribal versions that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave. So that's an interesting Kiddush. I was very happy because, I had heard this years ago, I think as a child, and I mentioned it a few times, and people always asked me for the Makor. I didn't have a Makor. I couldn't find a Makor. But finally, somebody sent me, Rav Moshe Wolfson, who was just nifter a few days ago, the great Mashgiach of Torah B'das, mentioned it in the shir, and talking to his Talmud, I was finally able to get a Makor for it. So it's from the Kamarna Rav. So it's nice. Rav Moshe Wilson was just nifter, so it's nice that we say something that I learned from him that should be Le'iloi Nishmaso. Yeah.
Could the rabbi perhaps expound upon the nafkamina between an ayin and the aleph?
I don't know. This is not the example I gave you was Aleph and Hey. Yeah, Aleph and I. The truth is there's so much we don't know. I mean, if you look at many features in, I'll say, the Masoretic text of the Torah, so you have all sorts of features. You have Kri and Ktiv. What is Kri and Ktiv? Sometimes a word is written a certain way, Ktiv, and you pronounce it a different way. Meaning it's read one way and it's written another way. That's called Kri and Ktiv. Sometimes, quite literally, a word is read that's totally different than the word that's written. Right? Now, where do you get that? Now, a secular Bible scholar says, this was a mistake. Somebody wrote the wrong word. It got corrected. No, we believe HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave both versions. HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe, write it this way and read it this way. Now, you ask me why. I don't have a reason always. Now, sometimes the Gemara has a whole machlokas. When you darshan halacha, right? If you learn Masechah Sukkah, so you know this. If you darshan halacha, do I say yesh aim lemikra, that the mother of drasha, the mother of drasha, is based on the way the word is read, or yesh aim lamasoris, the drasha is based on the way the word is spelled. So sometimes we actually have drashas, but a lot of times we don't. Most of the kris and the ksivs, we have no hint. You have big letters and small letters. Some letters are written extra big, and some letters are written extra small. The Aleph of Vayikra is written small. Echad, Hashem Echad in Shema, the Dalet is written big. The Ayin of Shema is written big. So you have Kri and Kesiv. You have big letters, small letters. You have sometimes dots over letters. In the Torah, dots over letters. You sometimes have things like V'hi ben Soa Aaron is set off by two nuns that we don't even read, which are upside down nuns. These are features that Hashem told Moshe what to put in. And for the most part, we don't even know what it represents. It's quite amazing how little we know about a lot of things, because Chazal didn't always tell us, or it got lost, or whatever it is. With all the Midrashim, with all the Chazals, we don't have a comprehensive explanation of Kri and Kesiv. We don't have a comprehensive explanation of big letters, small letters. We don't have a full explanation of dots, although we have partial explanations in some of the places. And we don't have explanations of hey, of Aleph versus Hey versus Ayin and the like. But we do believe that these are all HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu dictated how to, not just what the words are, but how to spell them, how to write them, and the like. So some people have tried to write modern Sfarim on it. So you can actually get a modern Sefer that tries to explain Kri and Ktiv. But it's a modern sefer. It's somebody's thoughts, somebody's chidushim and the like. But if you're, which may be fine, perfectly good. But if you want to go back to original Makairos that explain this, there's a lot of stuff you're not going to be able to find, Pashut, which means a lot of the Torah Shebaal Peh in the course of the centuries has become lost to us, meaning we've received a lot. We have certainly received a lot. There's a lot we have not fully received, and we have to await Olam Haba, the Yemos HaMashiach. The Rambam even says, when the Rambam discusses the Talmud Yerushalmi, so he mentions there's a Yerushalmi on 5 orders of the Mishnah. Yerushalmi on Zera'im, which there is, and there isn't in the Bavli. A Yerushalmi on Moed, a Yerushalmi on Nashim, a Yerushalmi on Nezikin. So far, so good. That's 4 orders. And then he says there's a Talmud Yerushalmi on Seder Kodshim. Korbanais, Zevachim, Menachos, Chulin. Problem is, if you look in your Talmud Yerushalmi, there is no Talmud Yerushalmi on Kodshim. So what happened? We lost it. Apparently, between the Rambam and some unknown date, we literally lost a Seder of Gemara, at least Yerushalmi. That's a pretty big loss. I mean, that's, you'll lose. I mean, this is not talking, if I tell you lost the Gemara, that means I misplaced my Gemara on the bus. Okay, that's one thing. We're talking about we lost the whole thing. We lost Bava Kama, we lost the Masechta. Not a Gemara Bava Kama, we lost the Gemara itself. So that's quite amazing, but it highlights in a very dramatic way that we have lost many halakim of Torah. There are many Midrashim, Rishonim bring, that they quote Midrashim that we don't have in the Midrashim that we have. So where did they get a Medrash from if we don't have it in our Medrash? The answer is, as the Gra writes, the Rishonim had Midrashim that were lost. In the days before printing, when Svarim had to be handwritten, hand-copied, it was shaykh. There may have been like one manuscript of something, it gets lost. So, I don't want to digress too much, but I think I mentioned to you the story that around 150 years ago, I don't have the exact date, there was a rabbi who claimed that he discovered the long-lost Yerushalmi, partial at least, on Seder Kodshim. He actually discovered a Gemara, Chulin, Maseches B'chayres. And he published it, and he wrote a Rashi commentary on it, and he wrote a Tosfos commentary on it. And he actually had Haskamos of Gedalim that said, an amazing thing, what a simcha. We rediscovered 2 Masechtas of a lost Yerushalmi. That's a big deal. It turned out that the guy forged it. It turned out to be a forgery. Now, you have to be very, very talented to forge a Gemara, and forge Yerushalmi is even more because people are less accustomed to it, and do such a great forgery that even Gedolei Hador might be tricked, might be fooled. But it does turn out that it was a forgery, and we don't have the Yerushalmi uncovered. How did the forgery get uncovered? So there are 2 versions to the story. One version of the story is that the great Rogatchover guy, who was the Hasidic Rav in the town of Rav Meir Simcha, who was the non-Hasidic Rav, the Rogatchover, whose memory was unparalleled, said the following. He says, in every Masechta of Shas, Bavli and Yerushalmi, there is always one Amora, or Tana, who is not mentioned in any other Masechta of Shas. Meaning most Tanoim and Amoram are mentioned in many Masechtas, right? Abaya, Rava, they're mentioned everywhere. But there will be one person who's only in Brachos, not anywhere else, and one person who's only in Shabbos and not anywhere else, and one person who's in Sukkah and not anywhere else. So, and this is true in Bavli and Yerushalmi. So the Rogatchover said, when I went through this Chulin and Bechoros, I didn't see a single name that was not mentioned in other Masechtas. so I know it must be a forgery. This is the rugged shower. This is the only one. The other story is a little less dramatic. The forger simply had to tell somebody. So, it's very hard not to tell somebody. You pulled off a feat. You forged a Gemara. I mean, wow, that's pretty impressive. I mean, it's very bad, but it's a very impressive intellectual feat. You tell somebody, so that's it. What do they say? The Ksais HaChayshin writes in the Hakdama about the need to share your Hatzlacha with people. It says, even if you were taken to Gan Eden and you were shown all of Olam Haba, if you wouldn't have anybody you could tell it to, the Simcha would not be complete. This is the story they tell about a rabbi who was a golf fanatic. He had to play golf before davening every day of the year, even Shabbos. He had to play golf. So even Yom Kippur, he gets up early, goes to the golf course. He's going to play 18 holes before Shachris. So the Malachi Hashares gather together in Shemayim, and they say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, let us strike this man dead, a Rasha, on Yom Kippur, the holiest day, the day of Tshuva. He plays golf. Says, kill him. He deserves to die. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, let me handle it. I'll handle it better. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu handles it. The rabbi gets a hole-in-one on his first shot, which he never had in his life. So the Malachi Hasharei say, this is what you do, this Russia, Marusha, you give him a hole-in-one? What is this? So Hashem says, yeah, who is he going to tell? He can't tell anybody that in Yom Kippur he got a hole-in-one. So that's what happened with the Yerushalmi. The guy couldn't hold it in, and Memela, he told somebody, so it gets out in various ways. Again, my digression is simply to point out that there are many halakim of Torah that we were not zeicha to have, and much of the Torah shebichsav, much of the features of the Torah, the dots, the big letters, the small letters, the Kri and the Ktiv, we have retained them, so we know what they have to be, but we don't always know their significance. We Pashut don't know the meaning of it. The Gemara says by Divrei Hayamim, in the first, which we'll get to eventually, the first 9 prakim of Chronicles of Divrei Hayamim are lists of names, just lists of names, yichus of shvatim, all sorts of obscure names. You don't even know what it is. In fact, they say that if you wanted to be a Talmud of the Vilna Gaon, he wouldn't accept you unless you had a geschmack for learning. You had to show that you loved Torah. If you didn't love Torah to the highest level, you couldn't be his Talmud. So what was the test? The test would be, he would give you Divrei Hayamim, just read names, Adam, starting from Adam. He says, most people find it kind of boring. I'm just reading names. Father, son, just unending list, he says. But if you love Torah, you will get a geschmack, even in reading the names. So you'd have to read it 100 times. If you were bored by the 100th time reading lists of names, your cheshek for Torah is not strong enough. That was the cheshek of Torah. So the Gemara says that all of these names in Divrei Hayamim really have hidden meanings. They are nicknames for certain spiritual ideas. And it mentions that between one pasuk and another pasuk, which is a repeat, there's 20 psukim and then the pasuk is repeated. He says, we had so many drashas that would have been scores of donkeys would have baskets carrying all the drashas on these psukim. Meaning on 20 psukim, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of drashas. And we don't have any, we have a tiny bit. Maybe we have in the Midrashim 0.5% of what those drashas were. So it's a chaval, as Baruch Hashem, as much Torah as we have. And Baruch Hashem, we do have a lot of Torah, so we have enough to keep us busy our whole lives and more. But there is pashut so much that we have lost. We have lost. So a lot of the ayin and the aleph and all of those inyanim, we don't necessarily have. But anyway, I did want to mention the Ibn Ezra because, as they say, better you hear it from me than hear it from the street, because you may hear from different apikorsim who will try to undermine your faith that the Torah is from God. by bringing in what are called Post-Mosaic additions to the Torah. So the 2 points I want you to know is, number one, that is not the accepted view in Klal Yisrael. The accepted view is the Shita of the Rambam. But number two, and this is equally important, even like this very minority view, that certain things were added later, these are not matters of halacha or mitzvah. These are matters perhaps of narration or historical updating. The Rambam rejects even that. The Ibn Ezra at least acknowledges the possibility that perhaps that was the case. Okay, but as I say, the Rambam does not accept that at all. And again, the mainstream shita that we're noyeg in Klal Yisrael is the Rambam's view that every letter of the Torah was dictated by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, other than, as they say, well, everything was dictated by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but to Moshe, other than the last 8 psukim, which is still dictated by Hashem, but perhaps, like one Mandi Amar, it was to Yehoshua, which puts Yehoshua in a very, very unique role. I mean, Yehoshua, in a sense, is the only human being who kind of was a shtickle partnership in the Torah Hashem. In other words, the Torah would be like this opinion, 99.999999% Hashem to Moshe. Yehoshua had a shtickle tail end in that, yeah.
In the Shita of the Ibn Ezra,
Yeah.
even these later editions, would they have been dictated by Hashem or...
So this is a very, very interesting question, meaning if you were, and again, this is not the mainstream view at all, but if you were to posit that things were added at a later date. So the question is that still al pi Hashem, or was that through Ruach HaKodesh, or some other process? Not entirely clear. The easiest would be, or at least the one that gets it closest to the hashkafa of the Rambam, would be that was also al pi Hashem, but a little later. But it's not clear. It's not borer that's what they're saying. They might even be positing a human intervention as long as it did not interfere with the divinity of the revelation of the mitzvot and the like. Yeah.
How the Rambam reconcile the different letters. And another rabbi said he brought the Rebbe, Siddish Rebbe, who said each shaver was given slightly.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm sure there's a view that every single shaver was given the exact same Torah.
Sure.
Perhaps Alex to the Hayes, but perhaps through human error in software. At the end of the day, they didn't have technology, but we have halachic guidelines in order to determine how to which Sefer Torah is the kosher one, as you said, by majority.
Yeah, you're correct. I mean, listen, the Kamana Rebbe's Chiddush is a big Chiddush, although I like it because it avoids the implication of mistake. But you're right. I mean, the simple pshat is errors, some errors were made in transmission, and therefore we needed a halachic mechanism for the resolution of error, and the halachic mechanism was following the majority. I mean, that's 100%. I mean, that is the Pashut pshat.
And through Hashgacha, one could say that it turned out the one we have today, is the original one that was given at Har Sinai through the mechanism Hashem gave in order to reconcile our Torah back. Again, I think that's perfectly legitimate. That Hashem created rules which will result in Hakadosh Baruch Hu's hashgacha that things will turn out right. Even though logically there would be no guarantee, but this is how Hakadosh Baruch Hu arranges the world. I think that's just the raya that shows that it's in the Nevuah and the Torah.
Yeah.
We have the Hashem says that Jewish people should remain few in number.
That's correct. That's correct. The Rambam will learn that those things are just nevuas, that the Torah refers to future events that haven't happened yet, and therefore you can't use those psukim as a raya that something wasn't written down until later. Yeah, in Echanami, because we believe anyway that in the Torah, at least indirectly, every future event is merumas, sometimes more explicit, sometimes less explicit. Yeah, Echanami. So that would be how the Rambam would understand it and the like. Of course, there's another interpretation the Ibn Ezra himself gives, that when it says, these are the kings of Edom before there was a king in Israel, the king in Israel is Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was called the first Melech. And therefore it's simply saying, these are the kings before Moshe. And it's not referring to Shaul or David. Right? So there are different ways of interpreting it. But it's a live controversy. I mean, it's an interesting thing, because those who want to claim the Torah was written over time, this is standard biblical criticism, they'll point out all sorts of things. And Baruch Hashem, I mean, we have terutzim to them. I don't want to get into it, be arichos mamish, but at least be aware of the question, and then, you'll be able to find out, if you go into it and you have questions, you can ask me and I can send you more Makaimis on it. But for purposes of our share, I prefer really just to go with the Rambam, simply because I might get fired if I go in the other direction too much. So I'm going to, okay. Any question or comment on it? Okay, all righty. What are we up to here? Okay. So now let me just mention the following. We have in the Mishnah a very interesting thing. This is Maseches Yodayim, which is in Seder Tyrus. And we have what you might call canonization controversies. The canon, it's an English word, canon is the term for the sacred books, right? So the 24 books of Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim, are called the canon. And when it was decided that a book belongs in Tanakh, that is called canonization. Now, you actually have machloksim in the Mishnah, machloksim among Tanoim, if certain books belong in Tanakh or certain books don't belong in Tanakh, meaning it was a machlokes if a sefer is within Tanakh. This is not a machlokes. This had never been a machlokes about the Torah. I'll give you the specific examples in a moment. Or whether it was not in Tanakh. For example, Shir HaShirim, which, of course, in our Tanakh is part of the Ksuvim. It's regarded as a holy book. But there was actually a machlokes Tanoim, if it's in or not in. Koheles, also by Shlomo HaMelech, was a machlokes. Meaning to say, it was not always a davar pashut if a book was considered holy to be included in Nach, or not holy to be excluded from Nach. And there were machloksim about this. So, what's interesting is the machlokas is expressed in a very funny way, almost a counterintuitive way. And that is, it's expressed, if touching this book will make your hands tameh, or will touching this book not make your hands tameh. One way the book is holy, one way the book is not holy. Now if I were to ask you, okay, let's match up. In other words, it makes your hands tameh or doesn't make your hands tameh. If it's a holy book, what would you say? And if it's a non-holy book, what would you say? So I would normally gravitate to the idea, if something makes your hands tameh, that probably means it's not a holy book. If it's a holy book, it's not going to make your hands tameh. Wrong. Exactly the opposite. Holy books make your hands tameh. Non-holy books may make your neshama tameh, but they don't make your hands tameh. So, you pick up a novel, your hands are not tameh. You pick up, I'll discuss what this means exactly. You pick up a book of Nach or Torah, your hands become tameh. So Chazal used Tumat Yadayim as the surrogate for discussing whether a book has Kedusha or not. So what's going on? So let's talk a little bit about Tumas Yadayim. D'oraisa, there is no such concept as your hands becoming tamei. No such thing. If I touch a sheretz, a dead animal, whatever, or a dead body, I become tamei. My whole body becomes tamei. There is no musa d'oraisa that your hands become tamei and not your body. But midrabanan, totally, Tumas Yadayim is the Gamri midrabanan, although some say it's a very early midrabanan, as early as Shlomo HaMelech, so that's also a drabanan, that midrabanan, there are certain circumstances that your hands become tamei, and in order to be metayr your hands, you have to do netilas yadayim. Netila, you don't go to the mikveh, right? If my whole body is tamei, I got to go to a mikveh. If my hands are tamei, I need netilat yadayim. So what are the types of things that make hands tamei? So for most of us, it would be the situation of touching parts of the body that are normally covered and the like. And that's tumas yadayim. So before bread, you take off the tumas yadayim, etc. But if you have unwashed hands, so there's tumas yadayim. So tumas yadayim pasal truma. If your tamei hands touch truma, the truma is tamei, it has to be burnt. Right? Tumas yadayim, or yadayim, that are tameos, poslos, esa truma. Okay, that's the yisod. Technically, if you're more conversant, actually a lot of you guys are learning Saita, right? Did you get to the part, this is really, really hard. I'm wondering how you covered it. There are sugyas in Saita about Tumas Eichlin, Tuma V'Taira, Rishon, Sheni. Did you get to that yet? Yeah, wow, that's pretty hard. So the basic idea is, Tamei Yodayim have a din of a Sheni Latuma. A Sheni does not make Chulin Tamei. If I touch a regular apple with my unwashed hands, the apple is not Tamei. But if I touch a Truma apple, a Truma, we go all the way to Shlishi. And therefore the Sheni makes it a Shlishi. So by Truma, see, when it's Chulin, I only have to wash my hands for bread. We'll discuss why that is. I don't have to wash my hands before I eat fruit or vegetables. But if it's Truma, you have to wash your hands before you eat anything of Truma. And indeed, you have to wash your hands before you even touch Truma. I cannot touch an apple of Truma unless I do Netilas Yadayim, because Yadayim are poslos esa Truma. So let me just make very, very quickly. Here's the problem. People used to store the scrolls of Kisvei HaKodesh together with their Truma. They put them in the cabinet with Truma. Why? Because they said Truma is called holy, Kadosh, and Svarim are called holy. Let me keep my Kadosh Svarim with my Kadosh grain. What's the problem? Well, mice even eat Truma. So what happens is, the mice were coming in and eating the grain, and if they were eating the grain, they would also eat or chew the Kisvei HaKodesh. Mutal bebizoyin. So what did Chazal say? Chazal said, so this is what we're going to do. When you touch Kisvei HaKodesh, your hands become tamei, and that would make the Truma tamei. So I wouldn't keep my Kisvei HaKodesh next to my Truma, because when I reach out to get the Truma, my hands become tamei, my Truma becomes tamei. In other words, Tumas Yadayim was a way to keep, or Tumas Kisvei HaKodesh rather, was a way to keep the Kisvei HaKodesh away from the Truma. So, if you put your John Grisham novel with the grain, we don't really care. Let the mice eat it. It'd be better. Right? So, it's not Mitamei V'Yadayim. So, this is where you get the counterintuitive idea that when Chazal say Mitamenes Yadayim, that's not a Chisaron, that's a Maila. Mitamenes Yadayim doesn't mean something is bad. It means something is Kadosh And that's why they were gozer tumas yadayim. When something is not kadosh, it's not mitame yadayim because we don't care where you keep it. Okay? So next time we're going to discuss the different machloksim in the Mishnah, which svarim are kisvei HaKadosh, which not. Meaning it wasn't a done deal that what we have in Nach was always makubal that way. There were different shitas that had to be paskin, lahalacha. What is nichlal and kisvei HaKadosh? And the way Chazal described it is with the unusual vocabulary, mitamin esayadayim, or not mitamin esayadayim. So it is a funny way. And they don't simply say kadosh or eino kadosh. They use tumas yadayim as the surrogate for that thing. Hey, so we'll invite you tomorrow.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.